One more sociodemographic variable that's extremely important to measure, especially in countries, cities, states, regions that are ethnically diverse, is measures of race and ethnicity. This is rather complicated and controversial, in part because of the concepts of race and ethnicity that have been used in the past, which are no longer viable because of the accumulation of evidence about the factors that lie behind our cultural assumptions about race and ethnicity. Race is rooted in an understanding of biological differences between populations. And often those biological differences are somewhat superficial in that they do not make too much of a difference in a person's biological functioning, but they do make a difference in some cases in how people are perceived. And that's why racial stereotypes can be so damaging. Ethnicity is rooted in cultural differences between groups. But here, culture is something that is learned. And as people become acculturated within a society, these differences tend to subside. So how do we measure these things? Well, typically, people are asked questions in social surveys about whether they're white or Caucasian or European, whether they're black or African American, Asian or Native American, at least in the United States. Other countries may have different groups or different ways of calling their groups. In addition, we have the accumulated biological evidence that genetic variation, particularly genetic variation relevant to populations, is much greater within a particular racial group than between these so-called racial groups. So blacks and whites in the U.S. share most of their gene pool, except perhaps for skin color, but even that has become blurred with interracial marriage. So it is important to be able to differentiate between these biological differences and the similarities across all people. The overwhelming majority of genetic variation is within groups, not between groups, so that the clustering of these genetic categories is something that we are going to be less interested in than the degree of a person's cultural assimilation. And only a few diseases are really specific to the racial categories that are often used to stereotype individuals. So one thing we do want to measure is their self-identification with a racial group. And it can be measured through a single question that asks someone to self-identify as white or African American or Asian. Ethnic group boundaries are also important to measure, and ethnicity emerges as a distinction between groups in the cultural background that they're identified with. And it is not something that's associated with biological risk, and it can be measured within each region where diverse or different ethnic groups are living. But the questions need to be constructed to fit the ethnic diversity of a particular region. And if you really want to study the effect of ethnicity on substance abuse, you also need to study the degree of acculturation, how many generations someone has been living in a particular area, particularly for people with Hispanic backgrounds.